Bonjour et bienvenue à cet événement virtuel organisé par les presses de l'Université d'Ottawa. Welcome to the virtual book launch of Beyond the Academic Gateway, organized by the University of Ottawa Press. Located in Canada's national capital, the University of Ottawa Press is a publishing arm of one of the top 10 research universities in Canada and one of the top 150 in the world, as well as the largest bilingual university in the world. The Press, one of the oldest presses in Canada and the oldest bilingual university press in North America, publishes award-winning peer-reviewed academic books in the social sciences and humanities, as well as literally non-fiction and fiction titles. Our publishing list is available on our website, www.press.uottawa.ca, where you'll find over 600 UOP titles in a variety of print and digital formats. And you'll be particularly interested in our education series titles. Take a moment to subscribe to our mailing list and to the link in our social media feeds. On behalf of the University of Ottawa Press editorial board, I'd like to thank the educational series editors Nicolas and Carole Florette for the vision they bring to the series. I'd also like to congratulate the volume editors, Tim Sibbald and Victoria Handford, and the volume contributors for sharing their personal lived experiences in the Tenure-Track, not only with the Academic Gateway, but now with a Beyond the Academic Gateway. Their first book addresses Tenure-Track experiences, while the book being launched today builds on that with the same collection of authors speaking about their experiences around the time of earning tenure. The press welcomes Tim and Victoria, and along with them, Frank Deer and Cecile Badenhorst. On to you now, Tim.
Thank you very much. I'm Tim Sibbald, and my co-editor, Victoria Handford, is with us today, coming from British Columbia. I'm in North Bay in Ontario, and we also have with us Frank Deer in Manitoba and Cecile Badenhorst, who's coming from Newfoundland. And we're delighted to have the official launch of Beyond the Academic Sabbatical. This book is focused on the time for academics around the moment when they receive tenure. And it's a particularly interesting stage in an academic's progress, if you will. This particular book, as Melanie mentioned, builds on an earlier book which was focused on tenure-track experiences. And we were delighted that we had the same collection of authors for both. For this presentation, we are going to have a little bit of an introduction about the book itself, and then we're going to hear from some of the authors, and then move into another few thoughts about the books, followed by a question and answer session. Along the way, you will find that you have access to a question and answer box somewhere in your Zoom window, and you're certainly welcome to pose questions which can be addressed in the question and answer session. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Victoria to introduce where the books came from.
Hi all. Bonjour, Witwip, ni hao. I am speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Secwepemc First Nation. And as I look out my window on Secwepemc, we have a cloud inversion here in the valley right now. So all I can see are the peaks of the mountains, and there's new snow up there. So for those of us that are skiers, we're quite pleased to see that. These territories have been the home of teaching, learning, and research for millennia. And I am honored that I get to participate in those activities while in Secwepemc. This book, Sibbald and Handford, first of all, it is called Beyond the Academic Gateway. Tim and I are working on a book on sabbaticals right now, and we do tend to mix the titles up a little bit. Looking back on the tenure-track journey. Tim and I met when we were working on a program accreditation for the professional programs at Lakehead University, now almost a decade ago. And I was the program officer leading the review. And one of the things that I noticed immediately about Tim among the panel members was Tim came with a very strong teacher voice. This was unusual. Often we have a variety of other voices at the table, but Tim was very focused on education and the purposes of professional education. Through that, Tim and I formed an ongoing friendship that has lasted us until we both moved to the academy. And then we realized that actually we were a big support network for each other. And somewhere along the line, as we would have, you know, phone calls every 6 or 8 weeks, it came to us that possibly other people were having this experience and we just didn't know it. So what we did was we put out a book, call for chapters, and the response to that call for chapters was really pretty phenomenal. So we knew we were on to something. And then Tim and I had to deal with, what do we do with all these calls for chapters? And or all these responses to the call for chapters. And we focused ourselves on faculties of education and in Canada, which gave us a very unique voice. It made us much less marketable to people in various other parts of the world, but it was a strong voice for Canada, and that was what we decided was important. Eventually, the authors and Tim and I met at a conference, the Canadian Society for Studies in Education conference, and we really formed quite a tight group. And those authors have stayed together, and they have personal relationships with each other at this point. From this book, the first book, which was about getting to tenure, we then came to book 2, and one of the things we wanted to do was start to bring a little bit more theory to the book. It's wonderful to have personal narratives, but we also wanted to bring a little bit more to that. And you can see on the screen some of the themes that we really focused on in this book. One of the questions that people often have is, why have we chosen images from the north for the book covers? And the issue there is that the north of 60, which is north in Canada, north of 60 is about 1% of the Canadian population. It's a very tiny number of people spread across the entire country and across the entire north, which is huge. And academics in the academy in Canada are about 1% of the population, and they are spread across the entire country. Often people think they understand the academy until they're in it. And often, even when you're in the academy, it is so different from one location to another that that common voice is a little diluted. So that's why we created these covers, or used images from the north for these covers, because it's 1% to 1%. The community of authors has endured, and we are so thankful, and we benefit so much from our authors, as well as from University of Ottawa Press, who took the risk of having 2 complete novice editors take on a topic that we didn't know where it was going to go, and we've had tremendous support and encouragement from U Ottawa Press, and we're pretty loyal to them now.
Thank you, Tori. So in terms of the books, looking at the Tenure-Track naturally led into Tenure, and there is a third book in the works, as was briefly mentioned, that is oriented towards sabbaticals. It's a little bit different, and we don't want to say too much about it, especially today when we're celebrating beyond the academic sabbatical, or beyond the academic gateway. One of the inspirations of this book, when the same collection of authors agreed to do the second book, was an inspiration from a documentary years ago called the 7-Up series. And the 7-Up series, which I knew well as a teenager, looked at a group of 7-year-olds and then followed up with them at age 14, 21, 28. And I believe they're now into their 60s at the last follow-up with them. But that approach was challenged along the way as far as whether or not it was sufficient in terms of theory. And so this is why Tori alluded to having these theoretical ideas sort of in the background with this book. We were attempting to address the shortcoming that's known to exist in the 7-Up series. We have been delighted to be recognized as having a very solid longitudinal study of the Academy through these two books. And we were also delighted in a similar way that the first book won an award from the Forward Indies in the career category. So we were delighted about that as well. But without further ado, I want to call on one of the chapter authors, Frank Deere, who is the Canadian Research Chair of Indigenous Education at the University of Manitoba, to give us some insight about his chapter and his thinking along the way. Frank?
Sagam, hello. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Tim. Yes, my name is Frank. I work at the University of Manitoba, and I've been there for about 10 years. And it's a pleasure to continue with Tim and Tori. With the second book, I was a part of the first book where I described experiences, insights, and observations about the Tenure-Track process. And now again, talking a little bit about where I'm at and where I see others similar to my situation in theirs after acquiring tenure at their respective universities. I am Indigenous. I'm from Kahnawake, which is just south of Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, if you will. Being an Indigenous faculty member, I do have sometimes opportunity to let that professional and ancestral identity govern what I write. So it's, again, a pleasure to work with Tim and Tori to offer me an opportunity to do a bit of that in this work. And in writing this piece, I was very mindful of how I try to continue to be committed to the academic mission as I see it and how it maps on to the academic mission of the faculty in which I work, the Faculty of Education at U of M, as well as my home university. But specifically, I work in Indigenous education. I am a school teacher by trade, and if I were to capture my research interests in a word, it would be understanding how Indigenous perspectives and experiences may be situated within primary and secondary education. My field is relatively new. And because it's relatively new, new things are being, if you will, discovered or more better understood, such things as the interface between community and school, such things as how Indigenous perspectives may operate within existing discipline areas like the sciences, for instance. I get a lot of questions about how to navigate that. So it's exciting time to be in such a new area, but it's that quality of constant discussion about what we mean when we mean Indigenous education. For whom is it intended? What are we intended to accomplish with our studies, with how we affect primary and secondary education? That is central to the chapter that I wrote. It seems to me that being at a university that although has some legacy in exploring Indigenous issues in some departments, for a large part is still coming to understand what, for instance, reconciliation means for a large U15 institution such as the one that I work. Because they are there's this constant discussion amongst Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, whether they're faculty members or not, it's made for an interesting experience. And the observations that I offer in the chapter that's in this new book are really around how one can perhaps understand how my small experience, my humbly limited experience in negotiating this relatively new field and how other faculties are managing this, but also to see how they may use those experiences to generalize, to map on to their own experiences and that of others. It seems to me that there's a lot of interest in many universities in Canada about how we engage with Indigenous engagement, as our university calls it. And if I were to respond to a previous question that Tim had posed, what's the point of tenure? I would say, and my chapter is written in such a way to respond in such a way to confront and remain critical of important and developing issues that are germane to Indigenous engagement. So it's a pleasure to be here. Nyawagoa to the University of Ottawa Press, and to Tim and Tori and my fellow contributors. Nyawagoa.
Thank you, Frank. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Cecile Badenhorst at the Memorial University of Newfoundland. A spoiler alert that she has recently become a full professor. The first book made no mention of whether or not people actually got tenure, so that's where the spoiler is. She also had spoken to her experience immigrating from South Africa to join the Academy in Canada. Without further ado, here is Cecile.
Thank you very much, Tim. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm also very grateful to Tim and Tori and to the University of Ottawa Press, because I don't think I would have reflected on my journey to tenure once I achieved tenure, and then sabbaticals actually was a really interesting reflection piece as well. I don't think I would have done that. And I think it was an extremely worthwhile process. So I'm an author on the two previous books and the one that's coming out now. What I wrote about in the first book was about being an international scholar. I had worked at a university before for 10 years. And when I received my position at Memorial University, I decided I was going to jump through the hoops as fast as I could, or as fast as the collective agreement would allow me. And you probably think this is a result of ambition, burning ambition. But actually, it's a result of 10 years of contract work and the insecurity that comes with that. So my goal was to find security. And the added layer that I didn't expect when I became an international scholar was that there's a lot of insecurity about being an immigrant and about being someone who's very different in the academy. So my chapter was about the pressure that I felt to conform and how I worked my way through that. So that, you know, I was worried about being different. So then always trying to fit in, and through reflecting on certain things, I was able to find myself in a way in that whole process. In this chapter, what I wanted to look at was time, because obviously time is really pressured on the tenure-track journey. And, you're always trying to manage time, trying to wrestle it into, to be into behaving well and the way you want it. And somehow it's never achievable. So that was my goal initially. But then, because I imagined that once I achieved tenure, time would slow down and I would get that slow thinking time and I would get that, deep thinking time. And of course, that never happened. In fact, time seemed to speed up and it intensified. But when I thought about it, there was a lot about what I did that was really enjoyable, even though, time was short. And I realized that actually a better way of thinking about how time works is through rhythms and energy. And what I mean by that is paying attention to the rhythms of your daily life. That became much more important to me, to have certain rhythms that I wouldn't compromise on, time for my family and things like that. And then to focus on the bits of the work that really gave me energy and to try and reduce the amounts of work that didn't. For example, when we teach, there's a certain rhythm to the semester, this kind of buzz at the beginning, flagging in the middle and trying to rally everyone, another kind of surge of energy at the end, and then this ending and relaxation. And I find that rhythm very familiar. I really like it. But I started doing a lot of online teaching and I found that I wasn't getting those same surges of energy. And because of that realization, I started to look for more face-to-face teaching and to balance out the online teaching with face-to-face teaching, even doing extracurricular workshops with international students. And even though they took up more time, they gave me so much energy that it was worth it. So that's what I really looked at, is how I cultivate things that boost my energy now and try and avoid the ones that don't, and how I pay attention to my bodily rhythms and the rhythms of the day and the rhythms of the year, just to help me keep in tune with who I am. And the reason why I think it's important to do this is because it's not enough just to work. It's important for me that I'm not just keeping my head above the water. I want to work with people that inspire me on projects that I enjoy. And I want to be really intentional about how I work. I don't want to rush through this experience, which I do really enjoy, without realizing what I'm doing. I want to be very careful about what I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile. And now, without further ado, we'll move on to the other end of Canada. Victoria Handford at Thompson Rivers University in British Columbia.
Thanks,
Tori.
Tim. It's always so inspiring to me to listen to Cecile and Frank and the other authors. And there's always little bits that they say that I think, oh, I should have thought of that, or that is so true. And even though you've done the work on their chapters and really thought about what it is they're saying, to hear it all again is just such a reminder of the incredible authors that we are privileged to work with. My chapter is called An Incredible Journey, Passing Through the Gateway. The essence of this story for me is that I have found in my life that it really doesn't matter where I think I'm going to end up in roughly the same position. And I am going to have had a variety of adventures along the way, but not much in function. Actually, I'm not sure how much control I've had, although you're making the decisions along the way. So when I began thinking about wanting to do a PhD, I actually wanted to do a PhD in musicology and was heading to the United States. And my mother insisted that I was going to enroll in a Bachelor of Education so that I could at least earn a living. And she enrolled me. And of course, that was the first change. One of the early changes in my pathway is suddenly I was a teacher and now I was heading down an education path rather than a music path. In this particular book, I talked about that I applied for tenure early, quite early. And right away, the faculty committee identified that they wanted more teaching evaluations. And I had done exactly what the collective agreement said, wanting to not pad my application, but have enough in my application. But I had not realized that the collective agreement changed September 1st, which was the day the sabbatical or the tenure package was due, and they actually wanted more teaching evaluations. I wasn't allowed to add. I could go to the Senate and explain. For me, that would have been so stressful that I just decided to withdraw my application and apply again the next year. There were big advantages in doing that. The number one thing being that my research agenda had become much, much clearer to me. So I had, of course, I already had enough teaching evaluations, but I had a couple more. What really happened in that year was it really became clear what my research agenda was. And that was a great thing. So what looked like a disaster actually turned out to be a really good thing for me. I did face some gender issues because in my second application, they then wanted, I had submitted 9 names as external reviewers. I was only asked for 3, but they wanted them, they then asked me to submit more women, which was not in the collective agreement. And by now I had really memorized the collective agreement. So I really pushed back on that and I gave them 3 more names and I made sure every single one of them was male because they can't ask for things that aren't in the collective agreement. Interestingly, it is now in the collective agreement at TRU that you should try for equity balance where possible, recognizing, of course, that certain things are not possible depending on your academic discipline and a number of other things. I also then focused on the issues of competence that emerged and relatedness and a general sense of autonomy, which for me, and I think for many academics, grows in time. This sense that I am choosing what it is I'm interested in. I think in the end, I would say that the journey is, for me, not one destination. It actually just goes on and on. As you choose another path, competencies and how that relates to one thing or another emerge. You become more and more autonomous, or at least I have. And I don't think that I've ended up anywhere that I couldn't have predicted at 22, where I thought I was heading towards a university, but towards a career as a musicologist. Here I am, all these years later, having had all these paths along the way that I won't even go into, but a lot of paths along the way. And yet, here I am, I'm at a university, I'm in an academic role, and it isn't music, but it is maybe just okay that this is where my entire professional career has led me. And it's not actually all that different a destination than what I imagined at 22. So I am going to leave that, Tim, and over to you.
Thank you, Tori. So I get to speak to my own chapter, and one of the things that being involved in a project like this results in is that you have to be one of the first people to write your chapter because it had to go in the proposal for the book. And so given that there was this sense of the longitudinal aspect of these books and the potential that we can sort of have another down the road and continue that longitudinal piece, I was very concerned about the challenges to the 7-Up, and I was thinking about the theoretical side of this. And I found that the self-determination theory was a very interesting model for this. It involves things like demonstrated effort, which I had as an ongoing work ethic, and I've documented this elsewhere, where because I was in a prior career before moving into education, I was doing a lot of computer programming and constantly upgrading, which had this demonstrated effort. And when I got into teaching, I hit on the agency aspect of self-determination theory, where I pursued professional learning opportunities because this demonstrated effort was so ingrained. And I pursued the opportunities that were on offer on an understanding that in some way they would be relevant. I didn't necessarily know how, I didn't necessarily take them at face value. But for instance, if I took a leadership course, I might picture the teacher as leading the students and get some thinking from that. This then led to commitment, and for teachers, commitment is sort of a two-way street. There's commitment to your students, which all teachers demonstrate, and there's commitment to professional learning, and that was firmly ingrained in me, and so it resonated in terms of self-determination theory. Connections within the role, which are called relatedness, were clear. And this was one of those things that got very disrupted by moving to the academy. I was in southwestern Ontario, which is very flat, and I moved to North Bay, 500 kilometers, in order to get away from the flat as much as anything else. And there was this huge sense of losing connections. I didn't know people in the institution, so I didn't know who to go to for this or that, where I had in the school. I didn't know the times that stores were open on the sort of living front. I didn't know where to go for particular things. When an appliance broke, I didn't know where to get parts for appliances. There was a huge range of things where I felt I became disconnected. And it wasn't just in terms of the role. It was in part in that connection between life and work that many academics in the book speak to becoming somewhat blurred and having to find balance. But because of this disruption, there was a need to put in something to address that disruption. And we felt that a grief model might fit with this in the sense of a loss of workplace culture, a loss of connection to the place where you're at. And the Kubler-Ross model, which is not a linear model, it's often mistaken that way, but seemed to suit. And there were a variety of things along the way. In the very earliest stages, I was in a denial phase where I was on a leave of absence from the school board, and I said, well, I could always go back if things didn't pan out. And eventually I had to terminate that connection to the school board, and I was in this sort of purgatory, if you will, of not having tenure but not being able to go back to the school board in an easy manner. And so this kind of loss of connection really fit with this brief model, which seemed to be necessary to address relatedness. Ultimately, however, this led to questioning competence. I knew that things I wanted to do would take longer. So then it became, are there enough hours in the day? I found that my competence, my sense of competence was oscillating. I'd have days where I seemed to have a number of victories and things were good. I had other days that were more challenging. The intrinsic motivation comes in from this, and that ultimately said I had to trust in myself. And in terms of the chapter, I go on from there and speak about autonomy and realizing that the job is not guiding where I go. I have to trust in myself as an academic and go where that takes me. And that's all I'm going to say about my chapter. It is time for us to move on and speak to the rest of the book. There are a number of other authors in the book, and they are from across Canada. A couple, Manu and Margarita, have had connections to other countries. Margarita moved back to France, and Manu was in the US for a little while. The variety of authors bring a lot of different perspectives to the book, and it's fascinating to read such a variety of things that can happen. We were quite impressed that Joan came out publicly to speak to mental health issues inside the academy, and it's very useful to read this and be aware of what that looks like. It's a phenomenal contribution to the book. We should also acknowledge that Trish Rossborough has passed on since the book was through peer review and prior to its publishing. Without further ado, though, I'd like to go on and have Tori address this question of, with so many different points of view, so many different approaches and tenure experiences, how do you organize a book like this? And we'll let Tori address that.
So what we did as editors, when we had kind of figured out who's writing and we'd seen drafts of their chapters, and we thought, okay, so this is what we're doing. Now, how are we going to organize this? Because they've got quite different messages, which is wonderful. I think a lot of people can find themselves in at least one chapter, but likely not in all chapters. So we put together a way of thinking about them that it changed over time, but we put people on a line of, are they speaking individually or are they speaking more of a systemic view? And Tim and I plotted where we thought individuals were approximately on that line. And then we plotted them on, are they speaking personally or are they speaking institutionally? And plotted them along on that line. And then it emerged that actually Tim is a mathematician, and he decided that, you know what, we can actually just join these lines and we will have a really interesting, not carefully researched, but from the subjective view of us, where do these people fit? And lo and behold, what we had was almost a perfect divide of the chapter authors between personal and systemic, personal and individual, individual and institutional, and institutional and systemic. The reason we have such big circles for these authors is we know that we may not have this exactly right, the exact location. And rather than have us agonize about their location, we made it fairly big circles so that they fit within a range in that area. But it has made a really interesting organization for the book. And I have heard my own dean talk about this grid in relation to academics. So actually it is ringing true for a number of people. And that's an interesting thing to think about. And I'll just leave it at that, Tim.
Thank you, Tori. So at this point, this brings us to the question and answer session. And if anybody has a question they'd like to ask, feel free to throw it in the question and answer box. And Melanie or Pierre, who've been acting behind the scenes, making all this happen, will bring it to our attention. Perhaps, though, to prime the pump, I'll throw out a question and save anybody from having to ask. So, Melanie, I'm wondering, is there a promo code, and does that promo code apply for just one of the books or for both of the books?
Thanks, Tim. Of course, the prize has a promo code. Everybody that participates today will get the email as well tomorrow with the promo code. So it's 20% off, and it's this book and the previous book as well. As long as you put it into the website on Les Presses, you'll be able to use it. In the meantime, though, I do have a question if I can go first. So the first one would be for Cécile. So how do you see this book informing academics who are on their journey to tenure?
Thank you. Yep. Well, I mean, there's so many different stories, right? So I think that somewhere in the book, you will find a story that you can relate to. But, you know, the tenure track process can be very isolating. It gets, you know, competitive, and there's a lot of pressure, and people start looking inwards and start saying, well, maybe I'm the problem here. But when you read the stories in the book, you begin to realize that actually, if everybody's experiencing this, then you can't be the problem. It has to be something that's a little bit more systemic. So I think it can be very helpful in that way. It can be comforting for people to know that others haven't, you know, just fallen onto the tenure track and breezed through. Not that I'm sure anybody does that. But I think it's important for people who are just beginning to realize that there can be lots of pressures and lots of difficulties, and that people find ways of navigating and negotiating them.
Thank you. Nobody in the chat with a question, so let me bring up my second one. This one will be specifically directed to Frank, although others can join too. So Frank, when you consider the journeys to tenure and Indigenous scholars, what 2 or 3 issues identified by the Indigenous scholars in this book do you think are among the most important for everyone in the university to keep in mind?
Hello, thank you for the question, Melanie. It's a good one. And there's many ways to answer that. I'll pick up on maybe 1 or 2. One of the things that I've heard from the outset of my professorial career is the idea that the service dimensions of our careers may be one that may be very taxing on ourselves and our workloads. And I wasn't sure how to apprehend that when I first began hearing it in 2009 when I started my assistant tenure track position. But it became clear rather quickly why why people would express such concerns. because many of us are in universities that for whom the exploration of Indigenous experiences, perspectives, and ways of understanding the institution are becoming more concerned. So, and that coupled with the concern of having more Indigenous people, including faculty members in such discussions and providing service has become more and more important. So you quickly come to a point at which you can feel you have to say no to the many requests and demands upon your time. But of course, in the tenure-track period, it's difficult to say no. And I felt that that would stop after acquiring tenure, but that really hasn't. And I think that is because, in part, because there's a responsibility I feel to my university, to my colleagues and others. So it's at times a responsibility I take on board quite happily. So the reason why that's important for universities and faculty members to be aware is because it's a workload issue. It's an issue for which there's an opportunity cost or a potential opportunity cost for doing so much work in the form of committees and in regard to community service, in regard to media opportunities and such. So that would probably be the principal one, that we need to be mindful of how we are making demands upon many, but they're understandable demands because we as a university community are becoming very interested in doing what we can to improve what we do for our respective communities. And there was a question from Leanne, by the way, Melanie, in the chat.
Okay. I did not. Okay, right here. Sorry, Leanne. So the question is, can you explain the difference between systemic and institutional in your organizational concepts? And that would be to everyone. Who wants to take it?
Why don't I start with that, and then I'll let Tim come in on that. When we conceptualize the difference between systemic and institutional, the focus of some authors was specifically on their university. And then there were authors that were focused on higher education overall. And their view was more, this is part of higher education. It may also be part of my institution, but here's a much larger issue that may cross all of Canada and perhaps all of the academy in the world. So it just had to do with how closely did they view this. Was it their university? What you just heard Frank say, for instance, and this is not to give away where Frank stands, but what you just heard Frank say was he described a systemic issue of indigeneity, higher education, the demands on academics, perhaps at his institution, Indigenous academics, but he also took that right across the country to higher education. It was a perfect example of a systemic answer or systemic expression. Tim, do you want to take a shot at the rest of that?
Thanks, Tori. I concur, and where Frank perhaps has spoken to the systemic element of the indigenization in the academy, we did have an author who got challenged on the tenure front for having too much service. Now that would be on the institutional side. So the distinction that's being drawn here really is with whether it's on the individual side, the personal side, as opposed to the institution you're in. But on the other side, it's sort of you and sort of the larger society. On the systemic front, for instance, it's almost impossible to do a book like this without the word neoliberal coming out. But there isn't an institution out there that declares itself as being neoliberal. And that is a systemic issue that's out there. Individual institutions may have their own ways of enacting that and putting it forward. But the neoliberal concept is larger than any one institution, and I think it sort of typifies it. I hope that's answered the question, Leanne.
Seems like it has. I can go ahead. Is there any more questions? No. I can go with one last one if you'd like. So how well did your experiences in the graduate studies inform your experience in the academy?
I'll have a crack at this one. Because with editing this book, where there are 14 chapters that show such a wide variety of experiences, I can't think of a way that grad school could properly address that huge variety. Now, what grad school can do is that if you have a really good relationship with a supervisor on a thesis and this sort of thing, and there's a strong relationship there, you may get quite a bit of guidance. But on the theoretical side, I wrestle with that because intrinsic motivation and autonomy are so difficult to bring out in people. And so I think grad school does a lot. And it certainly addresses getting your feet on the ground for the academy. But there is an awful lot to learn beyond grad school. And that really, I think, is the place of these two books, that this one sort of forewarns you of what you're coming at if you join the academy. And this one shows you sort of how that evolves. Tori, please do add on to that.
So for me, and then I'm going to pass it over to Frank and Cecile, because this is a question everybody should try and answer. Grad school did not prepare me for the academy. I actually think what I was a tourist in higher education. I had no idea, other than the research I was doing and, you know, the little bits of gossip that you would pick up in whatever. I really did not understand not only the department I was in, although I started to get that, but I did not know the faculty, and I definitely did not understand how that all related to the larger organization and what was going on politically. For instance, I'm from U of T, OISE UT. I really did not get it. And when I got to TRU, what I did understand of OISE might not have applied directly to TRU. OISE is a bit of a beast unto itself, and a lot of faculties are. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think my supervisor prepared me to do some research. I don't think, though, I understood the entire context of that.
Over to you, Frank.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And my experience is different than that of Tori's. I went to the University of Saskatchewan for my PhD program. It was a full-time program. I did not work whilst I was there. I was funded fully to be there. And there were expectations that the department in which I studied had for me as a student that went beyond simply studying and doing assignments in the courses that were required. I was expected, however tacitly, to teach. And it was set up in such a way that grad students had that opportunity. They did not have to apply at the time. You were expected to conduct research that was not associated with or even germane to your own doctoral research. You were provided opportunities and encouraged to support some of the administrative activities of the university and the department, and you were assigned rather good office space to do your work. You were a part of a community, and I would say for me that prepared me quite well. So I am now of the opinion, 10 years after starting my own professorial career, that not all grad study programs are the same, and some appear to be better situated to prepare students for academia. And I'm happy to say that my experience was one of them.
Thank you, Frank. Cecile, would you like to offer some thoughts?
Sure. I think my graduate program prepared me for research, but I don't think it prepared me for what the bombardment of that first year of Tenure-Track, when you have to set up your research projects, you have to teach, you're teaching new courses, you know, you're on these committees, you're trying to navigate the university system. There are just so many things going on that no, I would say no, it didn't prepare me.
Thanks, Cecile. Melanie, are there any last questions?
There are not, no.
Okay, well, in that case, we would like to express our thanks to the University of Ottawa Press. They've been fantastic to work with, and there's been ongoing support, and we really appreciate it. We'd also like to acknowledge Thompson Rivers University and Nipissing University for funding that associated with both the second book and the first. And we look forward to continuing this longitudinal sequence into the future. So thank you very much for all coming out today, and thank you, Melanie and Pierre, for helping facilitate this, and Frank and
Glad
Cecile.
to be here and glad to be part of this book as well.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.